Welcome to your Daily 5 for Tuesday, September 24th, 2024. You may or may not be aware that here in California, a recent bill has been signed into law which has the terribly clunky title of the Protecting Our Kids from Social Media Addiction Act, which, again, terrible title, but one that most of these bills... When you see bills like this, they typically include something about protecting children because it makes it very difficult to argue against, or so the theory goes. Whether the interest in actually protecting children is genuine or feigned, well, that's a separate discussion. But in particular with this bill, before we even get past to what I really want to talk about, I don't know that this bill can even work and whether it's going to survive a court challenge. Many people do not think it will, and even if it does, that there's no way to actually enforce it. So this may end up being a lot of lip service to something that cannot actually be enforced the way that it's currently structured. But let's assume that it is. Let's say, okay, it's going to go through, it's actually enforceable, all the rest of it. What you will see is a lot of debate over whether this type of regulation should even happen, whether it's appropriate for regulation on what children see, hear, and interact with is appropriate from anything outside of a parental level. Now, even there's some degree of discussion. You can get into some nuance there. But the interesting thing, to me anyway, is many times the people who are against this type of legislation and this type of regulation will bring up an example to say, they will say, well, this is no different than when people were having a lot of paranoia over books, movies, video games, music. And on the surface, when you first hear that, you think, oh yeah, that has happened before, so maybe this is just the same thing. Now, I don't want this to be construed as me arguing for regulating this type of stuff because I think it's impossible, and I don't even really necessarily think it's a good idea, at least not in the broad strokes that bills like this try to do it. This bill is particularly goofy in the way that it's trying to do it. But I don't think it's necessarily accurate to make those comparisons anymore either as an argument against it, because social media is different in the same way that big tech companies in the current age are different. Music, movies, books, those things certainly existed to profit off of the people who were purchasing them, but they also didn't really know anything about you. They were putting out a product, assuming there was an audience, but they didn't really get any feedback unless, of course, you wrote letters to the editor or, responded in some way or contacted the company. There was no real way for them to know outside of raw sales figures what people were responding to or not, and they really didn't have any ability, short of trying to contact you somehow, to really be able to pull much of your own information out of those products. Buying a video game didn't really tell the company anything about you outside of the fact that you like those types of video games, but they didn't, at least by default, know your age, anything more about you, where you lived, all that stuff. You would have to volunteer that information. And it would be pretty clear what you were doing. Whereas with a lot of these social media platforms, they have that knowledge. Both because in the early days, people were not thinking about their privacy when they started interacting with these things, but also because many of these platforms encourage people to give over as much information as possible, not only because they say they can tailor it so it works better for you, we can make your experience better, but because they can then sell that information and they can also start to form better ideas of how to market things to their users. And that is a significant difference. I'm not saying that justifies bad legislation and improper regulation. That is not my argument. But I also don't think you can just say, well, this is the same as violent video games back from the 80s and 90s when people were against that. Or, when violent movies came around, they were influencing people to become serial killers. I don't think that's the same thing. We know these social media companies have more instant access to intimate information than any previous forms of media ever did. Not to say that none of the previous ones couldn't get ideas about who you were, but it certainly wasn't as easy, as fast, and they did not have the mechanisms to influence you the way that they do now. So, again, that's not me saying I think that this bill is a good idea and that these laws are a good idea, but I also think that trotting out the idea that, this is just like when they get paranoid about stuff from before, I don't know that argument is actually effective now. I don't think you can say that there is a one-to-one comparison between a Public Enemy CD and Facebook. I don't think those are the same thing. So while, again, I'm not arguing that this type of thing that we should have legislation and regulation of this type, I don't think using an antiquated argument against it is really the most effective way to make your point. I think we need to acknowledge that there is a difference and then try to figure out if there's any way to address that difference. Later.